All of us have grown up reading great, intriguing, thrilling stories about private detectives chasing criminals from our very childhood. But what if the villain of the story is not even alive? My dear listeners of Wonderful Distractions, tonight, Wonderful Distractions brings to you William Hope Hodgson's legendary supernatural detective or ghost finder Carnacki. Today, we will listen to the first part of the story, The Horse of the Invisible. So without wasting further of our precious times, let us listen to the ghost finder Carnacki narrating his supernatural adventures with his friends in William Hope Hodgson's The Horse of the Invisible. The Horse of the Invisible. I had that afternoon received an invitation from Carnacki. When I reached his place, I found him sitting alone. As I came into the room, he rose with a perceptibly stiff movement and extended his left hand. His face seemed to be badly scarred and bruised, and his right hand was bandaged. He shook hands and offered me his paper, which I refused. Then he passed me a handful of photographs and returned to his reading. Now that is just Carnacki. Not a word had come from him and not a question from me. He would tell us all about it later. I spent about half an hour looking at the photographs, which were chiefly snaps, some of them by flashlight, of an extraordinary pretty girl. Though in some of the photographs it was wonderful that her prettiness was so evident, for so frightened and startled was her expression that it was difficult not to believe that she had been photographed in the presence of some imminent and overwhelming danger. The bulk of the photographs were of interiors of different rooms and passages, and in every one of the girl might be seen either full strength in the distance or closer, with perhaps little more than a hand or arm or portion of the head or dress included in the photograph. All this had evidently been taken with some definite aim that did not have for its purpose the picturing of the girl, but obviously of her surroundings, and they made me very curious, as you can imagine. Near the bottom of the pile, however, I came upon something definitely extraordinary. It was a photograph of the girl standing abrupt and clear in the great blaze of a flashlight, as was plain to be seen. Her face was turned a little upward, as if she had been frightened suddenly by some noise. Directly above her, as though half-formed and coming down out of the shadows, was the shape of a single enormous hoof. I examined this photograph for a long time without understanding it more than that it had probably to do with some queer case in which Carnacki was interested. When Jason, Arkwright, and Taylor came in, Carnacki quickly held out his hand for the photographs, which I returned in the same spirit, and afterward we all went in to dinner. When we had spent a quiet dinner at the table, we pulled our chairs round and made ourselves snug, and Carnacki began finally. "I have been in the north," he said, speaking slowly and painfully between puffs at his pipe, "up to his hints of East Lancashire. It has been a pretty strange business all round, as I fancy you chaps will think when I have finished. I knew before I went something about the horse story, as I have heard it called, but I never thought of it coming my way somehow. Also, I know now that I never considered it seriously, in spite of my rule always to keep an open mind. Funny creatures, we humans. Well, I got aware, asking for an appointment, which of course told me that there was some trouble. On the date I fixed, old Captain Higgins himself came up to see me. He told me a great many new details about the horse story, though naturally I had always known the main points and understood that if the first child were a girl, that girl would be haunted by the horse during her courtship. It is, as you can see already, an extraordinary story, and though I have always known about it, I have never thought it to be anything more than an old-time legend, as I have already hinted. You see, for 7 generations, the Higgins family have had men children for their firstborn, and even the Higgins themselves have long considered the tale to be little more than a myth. To come to the present, the eldest child of the reigning family is a girl, and she has often teased and warned in jest by her friends and relations that she is the first girl to be the eldest for 7 generations, and that she would have to keep her main friends at arm's length or go into a nunnery as if she hoped to escape the haunting. And this, I think, shows us how thoroughly the tale had grown to be considered as nothing worthy of the least serious thought. Don't you think so? 2 months ago, Miss Higgins became engaged to Beaumont, a young naval officer, and on the evening of the very day of the engagement, before it was even formally announced, a most extraordinary thing happened which resulted in the Captain Higgins making the appointment and my ultimately going down to their place to look into the thing. From the old family records and papers that were entrusted to me, I found that there could be no possible doubt that prior to something like 150 years ago, there were some very extraordinary and disagreeable coincidences, to put the thing in the least emotional way. In the whole of the 2 centuries prior to that, there were 5 firstborn girls out of a total of 7 generations of the family. Each of these girls grew up to maidenhood and each became engaged, and each one died during the period of engagement. 2 by suicide, 1 by falling from a window, 1 from a broken heart, presumably heart failure owing to sudden shock through fright. The 5th girl was killed one evening in the park round the house, but just how there seemed to be no exact knowledge, only that there was an impression that she had been kicked by a horse. She was dead when found. Now you see, all of these deaths might be attributed in a way, even the suicides, to natural causes. I mean, as distinct from supernatural. You see, yet in every case, the maidens had undoubtedly suffered some extraordinary and terrifying experiences during their various courtships, for in all of the records, there was mention either of the name of an unseen horse or of the sounds of an invisible horse galloping, as well as many other peculiar and quite inexplicable manifestations. You begin to understand now, I think, just how extraordinary a business it was that I was asked to look into. I gathered from one account that the haunting of the girls was so constant and horrible that 2 of the girls' lovers fairly ran away from their lady loves. And I think it was this more than anything else that made me feel that there had been something more in it than a mere succession of uncomfortable coincidences. I got hold of these facts before I had been many hours in the house, and after this I went pretty carefully to the details of the thing that happened on the night of Miss Higgins' engagement to Beaumont. It seems as the two of them were going through the big lower corridor just after dusk, and before the lamps had been lighted, there had been a sudden horrible gnawing in the corridor close to them. Immediately afterwards, Beaumont received a tremendous blow or kick which broke his right forearm. Then the rest of the family and the servants came running to know what was wrong. Lights were brought in the corridor, and afterward the whole house searched, but nothing unusual was found. You can imagine the excitement in the house and the half-incredulous, half-believing talk about the old legend. Then later, in the middle of the night, the old captain was waked by the sound of a great horse galloping round and round the house. Several times after this, Beaumont and the girl said that they heard the sounds of hoofs near to them after dusk in several of the rooms and corridors. Three nights later, Beaumont was waked by a strange gnawing in the night time, seeming to come from the direction of his sweetheart's bedroom. He ran hurriedly for her father, and the two of them raced to her room. They found her awake and ill with sheer terror, having been awakened by the gnawing seemingly close to her bed. The night before I arrived, there had been a fresh happening, and they were all in a frightfully nervous state, as you can imagine. I spent most of the day, as I have hinted, in getting hold of details, but after dinner I slacked off and played billiards all the evening with Beaumont and Miss Higgins. We stopped about 10 o'clock and had coffee, and I got Beaumont to give me full particulars about the thing that had happened the evening before. He and Miss Higgins had been sitting quietly in her aunt's boudoir, whilst the old lady chaperoned them behind a book. It was growing dusk, and the lamp was at her end of the table. The rest of the house was not yet lit, as the evening had come earlier than usual. Well, it seems that the door into the hall was open, and suddenly the girl said, "Shh, what's that?" They both listened, and then Beaumont heard it, the sound of a horse outside of the front door. "Your father?" he suggested, but she reminded him that father was not riding. Of course, they were both ready to feel queer, as you can suppose. But Beaumont made an effort to shake this off and went into the hall to see whether anyone was at the entrance. It was pretty dark in the hall, and he could see the glass panels of the inner draught door, clear-cut in the darkness of the hall. He walked over to the glass and looked through into the drive beyond, but there nothing in sight. He felt nervous and puzzled and opened the inner door and went out onto the garage circle. Almost directly afterward, the great hall door swung to with a crash behind him. He told me that he had a sudden awful feeling of having been trapped in some way. That is how he put it. He whirled round and gripped the door handle, but something seemed to be holding it with a worse grip on the other side. Then, before he could be fixed in his mind that this was so, he was able to turn the handle and open the door. He paused a moment in the doorway and peered into the hall, for he had hardly steadied his mind sufficiently to know whether he was really frightened or not. Then he heard his sweetheart blow him a kiss out of the greyness of the big, unlit hall, and he knew that she had followed him from the boudoir. He blew her a kiss back and stepped inside the doorway, meaning to go to her, and then suddenly, in a flash of sickening knowledge, he knew that it was not his sweetheart who had blown him that kiss. He knew that something was trying to tempt him alone into the darkness and that the girl had never left the boudoir. He jumped back, and in the same instant of time, he heard the kiss again nearer to him. He called out at the top of his voice, "Mary, stay in the boudoir. Don't move out of the boudoir until I come to you." He heard her call something in reply from the boudoir. Then he had struck a clump of a dozen or so matches and was holding them above his head and looking round the hall. There was no one in it. But even as the matches burnt out, there came the sounds of a great horse galloping down the empty drive. Now you see, both he and the girl had heard the sounds of the horse galloping, but when I questioned more closely, I found that the aunt had heard nothing. Though it is true, she is a bit deaf, and she was further back in the room. Of course, both he and Miss Higgins had been in an extremely nervous state and ready to hear anything. The door might have been slammed by a sudden puff of wind, owing to some inner door being opened, and as for the grip on the handle, that may have been nothing more than the sneak catching. With regard to the kisses and the sounds of the horse galloping, I pointed out that this might have seemed ordinary enough sounds, if they had been only cool enough to reason. As I told him, and as he knew, the sounds of a horse galloping carry a long way on the wind, so that what we had heard might have been nothing more than a horse being ridden some distance away. And as for the kiss, plenty of quiet noises, the rustle of a paper or a leaf, have a somewhat similar sound, especially if one is in an overstrung condition and imagining things. I finished preaching this little sermon on common sense versus hysteria as we put out the lights and left the billiard room, but neither Beaumont nor Miss Higgins would agree that there had been any fancy on their part. We had come out of the billiard room by this time and were going along the passage room, and I was still doing my best to make both of them see the ordinary commonplace possibilities of the happening, when what killed my pig, as the saying goes, was the sound of a hoop in the dark billiard room we had just left. I felt the creep came on me in a flash, up my spine and over the back of my head. Miss Higgins whooped like a child with the whooping cough and ran up the passage, giving little gasping screams. Beaumont, however, whipped round on his heels and jumped back a couple of yards. I gave back too, a bit, as you can understand. "There it is, there it is," he said in a low, breathless voice. "Perhaps you will believe now." "There is certainly something," I whispered, never taking my gaze off the closed door of the billiard room. "Shh," he muttered. "There it is again." There was a sound like a great horse pacing round and round the billiard room with slow, deliberate steps. A horrible, cold fright took me so that it seemed impossible to take a full breath. You know the feeling. And then I saw we must have been walking backward, for we found ourselves suddenly at the opening of the long passage. We stopped there and listened. The sounds went on steadily with a horrible sort of deliberateness, as if the brute was taking a sort of malicious gusto in walking about all over the room which we had just occupied. Do you understand just what I mean? Then there was a pause and a long time of absolute quiet, except for an excited whispering from some of the people down in the big hall. The sound came plainly up the wide stairway. I fancy they were gathered round Miss Hisgins, with some notion of protecting her. I should think Beaumont and I stood there at the end of the passage for about 5 minutes for any noise in the billiard room. Then I realized that a horrible funk I was in, and I said to him, "I am going to see what's there." "So am I," he answered. He was pretty white, but he had heaps of pluck. I told him to wait one instant, and I made a dash into my bedroom and got my camera and flashlight. I slipped my revolver into my right-hand pocket and a knuckle duster over my left fist, where it was ready and yet would not stop me from being able to work my flashlight. Then I ran back to Beaumont, held out his hand to show me that he had his pistol, and I nodded, but whispered to him not to be too quick to shoot, as there might be some silly practical joking at work after all. He had got a lamp from a bracket in the upper hall which he was holding in the crook of his damaged arm, so that we had a good light. Then he went down the passage in toward the billiard room, and you can imagine we were a pretty nervous couple. All this time there had not been a sound, but abruptly, when we were within perhaps a couple of yards of the door, we heard the sudden clumping of a hoof on the solid parquet floor of the billiard room. In the instant afterward, it seemed to me that the whole place shook beneath the ponderous footfalls of some huge thing coming toward the door. Both Beaumont and I gave back a pace or two, and then realized and hung on to our courage, as you might say, and waited. The great trade came right up to the door and then stopped, and there was an instant of absolute silence, except that so far as I was concerned, the pulsing in my throat and temples almost deafened me. I dare say we waited quite half a minute, and then came the further restless champing of a great hoop. Immediately afterward, the sounds came right on, as if some invisible thing passed through the closed door, and the ponderous trade was upon us. We jumped, each of us, to our side of the passage, and I know that I spread myself stiff against the wall. The chunk, clunk, chunk, clunk, clunk of the great hole falls passed right between us, and slowly and with deadly deliberateness down the passage. I heard him through a haze of blood beats in my ears and temples, and my body was extraordinarily rigid and pringling, and I was horribly breathless. I stood for a little time like this, with my head turned so that I could see up the passage. I was conscious only that there was a hideous danger abroad. Did you understand? And then suddenly my pluck came back to me. I was aware that the noise of the hoofbeats sounded near the other end of the passage. I twisted quickly and got my camera to bear and snapped up the flashlight. Immediately afterward, Beaumont let fly a storm of shots down the passage and began to run, shouting, "It's after Mary! Run! Run!" He rushed down the passage, and I after him. We came out on the main landing and heard the sound of a hoof on the stairs, and after that nothing. And from thence onward, nothing. Down below us in the big hall, I could see a number of the household round Miss Hisgins, who seemed to have fainted, and there were several of the servants clumped together a little way off, staring up at the main landing, and no one saying a single word. And about some 20 steps up the stairs was the old Captain Hisgins with a drawn sword in his hand, where he had halted, just below the last hoop sound. I think I never saw anything finer than the old man standing there between his daughter and that infernal thing. I dare say you can understand that queer feeling of horror I had at passing that place on the stairs where the sounds had ceased. It was as if the monster was still standing there invisible. And the peculiar thing was that we never heard another sound of the hoof, either up or down the stairs. And they had taken Miss Higgins to her room. I sent word that I should follow so soon as they were ready for me. And presently, when a message came to tell me that I could come anytime, I asked her father to give me a hand with my instrument box. And between us, we carried it into the girl's bedroom. I had the bed pulled well out in the middle of the room, after which I erected the electric pentacle around the bed. Then I directed that lamp should be placed around the room, but that on no account must any light be made within the pentacle. Neither must anyone pass in or out. The girl's mother I had placed within the pentacle and directed that her maid should sit without, ready to carry any message so as to make sure that Miss Higgins did not have to leave the pentacle. I suggested also that the girl's father should stay the night in the room and that he had better be armed. When I left the bedroom, I found Beaumont waiting outside the door in a miserable state of anxiety. I told him what I had done and explained to him that Miss Higgins was probably perfectly safe within the protection, but that in addition to her father remaining the night in the room, I intended to stand guard at the door. I told him that I should like him to keep me company, for I knew that he could never sleep, feeling as he did, and I should not be sorry to have a companion. Also, I wanted to have him under my own observation, for there was no doubt but that he was actually in great danger in some ways than the girl. At least, that was my opinion, and still, as I think you will agree later. We come to the end of the first part of the story. Till we bring the very short, we will bring the next part. Till then, very good night to all my lovely listeners. Stay home, stay safe. Thank you.